Truth should be a stubborn thing, right? We're not in today's society. Online, the YouTube suggestion algorithm has been shown to steer towards more extreme or far-fetched videos, spreading radical theories and fringe beliefs. And users on other platforms such as TikTok, Twitter and Instagram deliberately disseminate disinformation or misinformation on controversial issues. The reality is that lies, extremism and manipulation of reality seem to be common themes in today's current events. And never has it been more important to understand the science of how humans determine what is true and what is false. As discussed previously, our perception is inherently subjective and on occasion biased. We may believe that we are open-minded beings, but most people latch onto ideas that seem to validate their own preconceived beliefs, even if these behaviours prevented them from seeing new solutions. Such ingrained implicit bias has served us well in the course of evolution, but in the modern technological era, it often leads us astray and more divided. Indeed, humans superbly make and commit to decisions even when they don't have all the facts, and in some cases, those leaps to conclusions lead some to accept radical theories and other forms of disinformation and misinformation. The good news is that the practice of questioning your deepest beliefs, especially in light of strong evidence, strengthens your objectivity and critical thinking skills. Nowhere are our failings at objective reasoning more exploitable than on social media, used globally by billions. Facebook, TikTok, and other platforms enable the spread of disinformation and misinformation that further sows instability. In particular, meme culture has been shown to propagate lies and increase division. Platform algorithms that take advantage of our psychological vulnerabilities trap us into echo chambers. In the end, users become the unwitting victims of these threats. The common theme in many of these examinations of the state of our societal affairs is an encouraging indicator. By just being aware of how we perceive information, we can protect ourselves from disinformation and false narratives. Ultimately, we don't always have to agree, but at least we will be anchored in what is real and what is not. This video is a continuation of part 1 on disinformation and subversion. In this video, we want to discover why we are so easily targeted by malign state and non-state actors. We'll start by discussing implicit bias, a controversial concept on the attitudes and stereotypes that unconsciously influence our perceptions, judgments, and actions towards other people. Analysing this gives us greater understanding of how different entities can target demographics, instigating divide, unrest, and at times, violence. We will then focus our attention on the educational system and how children are the prime targets of disinformation. Thirdly, we'll discuss why humans have a willingness to share exploited content, knowingly or unknowingly further spreading disinformation. And finally, we'll touch on the black box of social media. Let's begin. We have a bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or aversion to a person or group of people. Thus, we use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associated stereotypes without our conscious knowledge. But what has this got to do with disinformation or subversion? Firstly, these biases can have a profound impact on our lives and the world around us, and they can easily be exploited by malign state and non-state actors seeking to create division and instability. These actors understand that by targeting implicit biases, they can tap into deep-seating prejudices and tensions that exist within society. They use this knowledge to manipulate public opinion and shape our public perceptions in ways that further their own interests and undermine social stability. One of the key ways that malign state actors target implicit biases is through the spread of false or misleading information and propaganda. They may spread false information about certain groups of people in order to stir up hatred and bigotry. They may also manipulate algorithms and use data mining techniques to target specific individuals and communities with disinformation which plays into their implicit biases. This can make it easier for them to spread their message, further tugging at the weathered fabrics of the societal construct. Another way that malign state actors target implicit biases is by amplifying extreme voices and suppressing alternate perspectives. They do this by spreading conspiracy theories, hate speech, and other forms of toxic content that can reinforce explicit biases and perpetuate harmful stereotypes. By doing so, they can create an echo chamber that reinforces the beliefs of those who are susceptible to their messages and makes it difficult for others to challenge them. Let's look at an example.
In those days, it was pretty hard to disseminate this kind of information. Nowadays, it's so much easier. Social media makes it possible.
An extensive effort to turn fellow Americans against one another. Now, perhaps the most iconic example of this was seen in one infamous incident where the Russian Internet Research Agency used Facebook to create two competing rallies on opposite sides of the same street in Houston. On one side were American flags and Confederate flags in protest of what was billed as the Islamicization of Texas, while counter-protesters had signs calling the other side Nazis while defending the local Islamic Center. The rallies were real, but the people participating didn't realize that they'd been duped by Russian trolls seeking to divide our nation. In some ways, it's the perfect metaphor for the dangers of disinformation, a fear-fueled feedback loop between activists who may be easily manipulated by foreign adversaries who understand that polarization is America's Achilles heel.
And the United States is not exclusive to this narrative. Protests have been established around the world, including Europe, Asia, and even Australia. The fact of the matter is, wherever there is perceived differences within a nation, this offers the opportunity to malign entities to manipulate and intervene, instigating chaos and division. Russian disinformation campaigns have also been known to amplify existing divisions within society. For example, during the 2016 US presidential election, Russian operatives targeted both liberal and conservative groups with messaging that played to their implicit biases. This including spreading false information about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, as well as amplifying content that sought to deepen existing divisions on issues such as race, immigration, and gun control. Another way in which malign entities target implicit biases is by creating fake social media accounts that appear to be run by genuine users. These accounts can be used to spread disinformation, amplify existing content, and build online communities that are receptive to the antagonist messaging. By doing so, entities can and will manipulate public opinion and shape the online conversation in ways that promote their own interests. Governments can use implicit biases as a tool for reinforcing social inequalities, limiting political opposition, and promoting their own interests. By exploiting the biases and prejudices that exist within society, governments can shape public opinion and maintain their grip on power. One way in which governments can use implicit biases is by creating and disseminating propaganda that reinforces existing prejudices and stereotypes. This can be done through various means such as state-controlled media, public education, and other forms of mass communications. By doing so, governments can shape the way people think about different groups of people and maintain their dominance over society. For example, in authoritarian regimes, governments can use propaganda to demonise political opposition or minority groups, portraying them as dangerous and subversive. This can be seen in countries like China, where the government has launched a massive campaign to vilify Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities, painting them as terrorists and separatists who threaten the stability of the state. By doing so, the government is able to justify its policies of repression and surveillance and maintain its control over the population. Governments can also use implicit biases to justify discriminatory policy and practices. This can be seen in countries where racism, sexism, or other forms of discrimination are entrenched in law and policy. By appealing to people's implicit biases and stereotypes, governments can justify these discriminatory policies even when they are widely criticised by human rights groups or other actors. Finally, governments can use implicit biases to maintain their grip on power by shaping the way people think about politics and social issues. This can be done through propaganda and other forms of messaging that promote the government's agenda and vilify its critics. By doing so, governments can create a sense of fear and division within society, making it more difficult for opposition movements to gain traction. It is important to be aware of these tactics and to be vigilant in defending against them. This can be done by fact-checking information, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being critical of sources that have a history of spreading false or misleading information. By being informed and engaged, individuals and communities can resist efforts to manipulate public opinion and reduce the impact of implicit biases. Children, as it turns out, are ripe targets for fake news or disinformation. According to studies, age 14 is when kids often start believing in unproven theories. Furthermore, many teens also have trouble assessing credibility of online information. In a 2016 study involving nearly 8,000 US students by Stanford University researchers, they found that 80% of middle schoolers believed that an advertisement labelled as sponsored content was actually a news story. The researchers also found that less than 20% of high schoolers seriously questioned spurious claims in social media. The fact is that disinformation campaigns often are targeted at young users, steering them towards misleading content. A 2018 investigation found that YouTube's algorithm, which offers personalised suggestions about what they should watch next, is skewed to recommend videos that are more extreme or far-fetching than what the viewer began with. Disinformation and propaganda are serious threats to the well-being of society, and the fact of the matter is children are the most vulnerable to their harmful effects. The reason for this is that children are still in the process of developing critical thinking skills and may not have the experience or knowledge to differentiate between fact and fiction. One of the tools schools use to deal with this problem is called media or news literacy education. The idea is to teach kids how to evaluate and think critically about the messages they receive and to recognise falsehoods masquerading the truth. A growing number of students are being taught some form of media and news literacy in college, but that has been identified as significantly too late. Even if students took this class, there is significant disagreement about what these courses should teach. Certain curricula try to train students to give more weight to journalistic sources, but some researchers argue that this practice ignores the potential biases of publication and reporters. Other approaches push students to identify where information comes from and ask how the content helps them disseminate it. Overall, there is minimal data showing the best way to teach children how to tell fact from fiction. Schools still have a long way to go, and one big challenge is how to expand these programs so they reach everybody, especially children in lower income school districts. The question remains, with teachers inundated with material that they have to impart, can they squeeze in more, especially if the topic is nuanced and complex? Ultimately, schools must invest in professional development and training in this field, as it is the most complex, fraught, and largest information landscape in human history. The good news is studies are continual and will support researchers to reach a comprehensive understanding of what works and what doesn't over the long term. What children are facing are transformational changes in the way they receive, process, and share information. Furthermore, schools are working to create an open and exclusive learning environment that encourages critical thinking and questioning. Educators are actively seeking to include diverse perspectives and viewpoints in their lessons, so that students can learn to recognise the biases and influences that shape our understanding of the world. Social media platforms are where billions of people around the globe go to connect with others, get information, and make sense of this complex world. The companies that run these sites, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Reddit, collect vast amounts of data based off everyday interactions that take place. And despite the fact that social media has become one of our most important forms of speech, several of the most important platforms are controlled by a selected few. Currently, Mark Zuckerberg controls 58% of the voting share for Meta, the parent company of both Facebook and Instagram, effectively giving him sole control of two of the largest platforms. Elon Musk has now taken Twitter private. All these companies have a history of sharing minute portions of data of their platforms with researchers, preventing them from understanding the impacts of social media on individuals and society. Such singular ownership of these three most powerful social media platforms make us fear this lockdown of data sharing will continue. After decades of little regulation, perhaps it is time to require more transparency from social media platforms. In 2020, social media was an important apparatus for the spread of false and misleading claims about the US election and for the mobilisation by groups that participated in the January 6 Capitol insurrection. We have seen misinformation about COVID spread widely online during the pandemic. Government officials have learned that social media platforms offer a valuable capability in reaching everyday citizens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Analytics within the platforms have provided an edge for parties based on data captured, allowing for targeting campaigns in swing states. And today, social media companies are failing to remove Russian propaganda and disinformation, instigating instability and divide nationwide. Let's be clear. Social media has become a major conduit for the spread of false information about every issue of concern to society and government. Platforms have assured legislators that they are taking necessary steps to counter dis and misinformation by flagging content and inserting fact checks. The question is, are these effective? Which brings us back to the original problem. Not allowing independent researchers access to certain data, we must take the owner of the platform's word for it. A larger problem is without all the information, we run the risk of creating laws and regulations that do not adequately address harms or inadvertently make the problems worse. One thing is essential, and that is that the security of personal information is imperative. Ultimately, the answer isn't easy, and if anything, more questions remain. Firstly, researchers suggest that misinformation is often more engaging than other types of content. Why is this the case? Researchers have indicated that novelty and emotionality are key factors, but independent researchers would require access to certain aspects of data to confirm whether this is true. Secondly, social media companies attempt to combat misinformation by labelling content of questionable provenance, hoping to push users towards more accurate information. Results from surveys indicate the effects of labels as mixed. Do labels reduce the spread of disinformation or attract attention to posts that might otherwise go ignored? Thirdly, internal studies of Twitter show that Twitter's algorithm amplify right-leaning politicians and political news sources more than the left-leaning accounts. This is flagged in 6 of 7 countries studied. Do other algorithms used by other social media platforms show systemic political bias as well? Social media has a potential to disseminate information quickly and to a wide audience, which can be both a positive and a negative thing. On one hand, social media can be a powerful tool for promoting accurate information and facilitating discussion and learning. And on the other hand, social media can also be a breeding ground for disinformation and propaganda. The question is, how and will these platforms be able to shed a beacon of truth through a dark sea of lies? Disinformation is not new, and if anything, through technological advancements, it is more prevalent now than ever before. We are all at risk, and the truth has become increasingly difficult to attain. In this video, we discuss the targeting of implicit biases, tapping into the deep-seated prejudices and tensions that exist within society. This knowledge is used to manipulate public opinion and shape public perceptions in ways that further their own interests and undermine social stability. We then shifted to the educational system and how children are easily targeted as they are still in the process of developing critical thinking skills. The educational system is working to combat this vulnerability, but there is still a lot of work in order to arm the youth with the required vetting skill sets. Finally, we discussed how online platforms has made it easier for anyone to share information, regardless of its accuracy or verifiability. This has led to a situation where disinformation can spread rapidly and potentially influence public opinion and behaviour. Access to data by independent researchers may assist these platforms in the prevention of disinformation, subversion, and propaganda. I thank you for sticking around to the end. That wraps up part 2. I would love to hear from you in the comments section. What are your thoughts, and do you think the future shows promise or more uncertainty? As always, stay safe, stay informed. This is Zero Foxtrot, out.